Okay, we're gonna start trying to go through the inyan of bringing kosher to America and its unique challenges and shilas, compromises, policies, procedures, etc. We'll start like this. I found this little sefer called Melechas HaKodesh from Rabbi Avram Yaakov Kaplowitz. He was a Rav who died in 1958. He was a Rav in Brownsville, New York. And he writes like it's like 100 pages, give or take the sefer. And he was a Shechita, and he was very, very busy with the sugya of improving Shechita in New York City. And the sefer is about like charting the history of Shechita in New York and how it got better and the different pitfalls that it had to deal with and etc. Now, before I talk about his Shechita charting, he just right in the first page of his sefer, he has such an interesting letter that I really got to, I felt something from it, so I just wanted to share it with you. He writes over here that he's dedicating the sefer. He's an old man. He's in his high 80s, maybe 90s already. He's dedicating the sefer to Ilu Nishmas' parents, who were not American. They never made it to America. He was born in Lita. He learned in Valazhin. He had smicha from the Netziv. He makes it to America, but he's dedicating the sefer in honor of his parents. And he writes, I want to give you a little bit of a feeling of who my father was. And he says, the best way I could do it, he says, is to bring a letter that my father wrote to my brother Rabbi Yosef Chaim as follows. It seems his brother Rabbi Yosef Chaim had certain breathing ailments that he was dealing with that he got when he was in yeshiva. He was in yeshiva and his room was not warm and it wasn't suitable, and he got sick, and for his whole life he had these breathing ailments. And he was writing to his father complaining, if only I would have never gone to yeshiva. That's what his brother Rabbi Yosef Chaim writes to the father. If only I would have never gone to yeshiva, I wouldn't have this problem, everything would be better. So he writes, I read your letter about saying, you're not feeling well, and I feel bad for you that you're not feeling bekava brius. And you said, if only you could have not gone to yeshiva. He says, l'chein, and he writes to l'hazke l'cha b'ni. Ki anoichi, he says, me, the father, balisi b'yeshivas harbe yoser mimcha. I wasted a lot more time than you in yeshiva, he says. And they didn't take any better care of me than they took care of you when I was in yeshiva. He says, and I'm living, and I'm Hashem, you're going to have a nice, good, long life also, he says. He says, much more than you wasted your time learning things that you think are irrelevant when you were young, I did. He says, the only difference is the way I see them. Those were days. Those were beautiful days. Still today, as an old man, those days, the yeshiva days from back then, are in front of my eyes. And when I open up any sefer, any gemara, any mesechta that I learned, from back then, kol teva v'teva nitzeves k'may haya lefanai. It all comes back to me, comes washing back to me like it was then. And he continues along this vein, and he says, if I'd be in front of you, I would confront you to your face and tell you how dare you talk like this, but I'm your father loving you from a distance and telling you this from far away. So it's like, Taka, the best way I could think to describe who his father is, he takes almost like a love letter that his father wrote to his days in yeshiva and publishes it. Now, it has absolutely nothing to do with what we're going to talk about, but it's in the beginning of the sefer. I thought it was nice and I wanted to share it. The sefer itself is talking about Shechita in New York City. And he starts off writing about how terrible Shechita in New York City is and how the few like him and Dr. Hillel Klein and Rabbi Yaakov Yosef came and tried to rescue it. And we'll get into a lot of those people, over the next few weeks in Mitzvah Hashem. But just to back it up, the way he starts it is as follows. The first Jews to come to New York City is in 1648, is a group of Jews from Brazil, Sephardim who came from Holland, moved to Brazil, and eventually they migrate from Brazil to another Dutch colony to New York, to New Amsterdam, before it was New York yet, and they moved to New York City. It's a group of 24 Jews who moved to New York City in 1648, and they open a shul that's still open today. The shul is called She'eris Yisrael, which is, the remnant of Klal Yisrael, which is how they saw themselves, Taka, like a small pocket of Jews who were left behind from one place to the other. They opened the shul called She'eris Yisrael. It was more commonly known as the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. Maybe some people have been there, have seen it. It still exists. It's still Orthodox, actually, which is crazy, that a shul that's open in New York City for close to 400 years is still Orthodox. It still exists in New York City, and it's still Orthodox. They open a kehillah called She'eris Yisrael, and who exactly their rabbanim are and what exactly the policies of their shul are, throughout the years it changes. For example, the JTS, which goes on to become the yeshiva for the conservative movement in America, was founded by the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. It was started as a yeshiva. Eventually, it got away from them and it became the JTS. Another very famous institution that we all benefit from on a daily basis was founded by them. The OU, the famed Kashrus organization, was founded in 1896 by the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. People don't know that the Sephardim get credit for that. Again, it's something that the organization eventually took on a life of its own, and it had developed its own leadership, and it went in its own direction, and it became no longer a subset of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. But just to give you a feel, these are the Yoshvim. These are the people who are in New York City, the longest, the oldest, and so they come here, Sheretz Yisrael, and they open a shul, and obviously, like any shul, they open a shechita. They hire a sheikhit, and he has a name here. The first sheikhit who came to America, I forgot his name, but the first sheikhit who came to America was, when I bump into it, I'll tell you. The first sheikhit who came to America was for Sheretz Yisrael, and the first one came in 1728, the first dedicated sheikhit. His name was Rabbi Yamin Elias. I don't know if he's a Sephardi, I don't know if he's an Ashkenazi, I don't know if he has any grandchildren alive today. I have no idea. We don't know anything about him. But Rabbi Yamin Elias is the first person who became to be a dedicated sheikhit for Sheretz Yisrael in New York City. And he gets the ball rolling, he starts, and he talks how they would bring, several sheikhim. And he writes over here such an interesting quote. He says over here, Rabbi Yamin Elias, he says, the Sheretz Yisrael at that time had no dedicated shlachtais. They didn't have their own shlachtais to shecht chicken and meat in New York City. So what he would do is he would get they would send him, they'd give him a route. He would go to different butchers, non-Jewish butchers, and he would do an animal by this butcher, an animal by this butcher, an animal by this butcher, and he writes over here, he says, he's a sheikhit, he says, I don't know how this guy had the koiches to run around from butcher shop to butcher shop doing this, and how the rabbanim had the koiches to overwatch such a procedure. It says, Rakli Yehudim Svardim, Shavasei and Masr Nafshim al Kedushas Hashem Be'eretz Meladatim Pesurneim. It says it has to be Svardim who were Moshe Nefesh from wherever they came from. They knew how to do this. This is what he's writing, Rabbi Kapelowitz, in the 1950s. So he's writing with great, he's marveling at the Mesiras Nefesh and the work that was put into it to keep Shechita alive in New York City. Now, it wasn't smooth. It wasn't always smooth flowing, and there was definitely fights. So he brings over here a few interesting ones, and one of the most interesting ones is we don't know what the halacha shaila was, but in 1748, I think, we don't know what the halacha shaila was. There was a woman who came to the Rav of the shul, or the Abbez, and she said, judging by this animal that I brought home to my house, I could tell that the cut was not done properly. I could tell that this is not a shechita cut. This is just a cut. Someone cut. This is not a shechita cut. I've gotten chickens shechted, hundreds of times. I know what a chicken, what the looks like, and this ain't what it looks like. She says. She brings it to the Rav, and the Rav confronts the sheikhit and tells the sheikhit, listen. The sheikhit's name was Reb Shmuel. The sheikhit's name was I forgot his name. We know his name. A lot of these cases are documented. The sheikhit's name, I think, was Reb Yaakov Abrams, and the Rav tells him, listen, I'm not going to jump to conclusions and say that it wasn't a good shechita. Fine. I'll tell you what, you bring me your knife, let me do a bedika, let me check your utensils, and if I find everything kadas u'kedim, we'll disregard what this woman's saying about you. If I don't, then we'll have to deal with it. To which the sheikhit replies, I'm the only sheikhit in New York City, you need me, I don't need you, take a long walk over a short bridge. And to his credit, the Rav at the time, whose name is Reb Shmuel Kaiser, I don't know anything about these people mostly, but to his credit, the Rav at the time, Reb Shmuel Kaiser, says, it's okay, we don't have to have chicken and meat. Okay, now that there used to be one sheikh in New York City, now there's no sheikh in New York City, no problem. And they have a stalemate for a certain amount of weeks until the sheikhit folds, the sheikhit caves, and the sheikhit brings his knife to be checked, checks it, the knife's okay, and things get back to how they were. So that's one story, Marshall. There's more of these, but for example, what he's trying to show from this, what Rabbi Kapelowitz in the Sefer Melachos HaKodesh is trying to show from this, is that there were all sorts of unknown heroes throughout the hundreds of years that led up to the New York that we know today, who had to take a stand, who had to put their foot down, who had to fight for something to make sure that Shechita would be maintained, that kashrus would be maintained. Most of the kasher shilas in the early days would be shechita because there was not a lot of products. There were, everything else mostly could be grown, could be harvested and grown, whatever. But there were people who fought. Now, one of the unique features of the American shechita scene, and this is the reason why why America will, l'daiti, I think the idea of a hashkacha, the way we know it today, meaning kasher is like a stamp, an OU, an OK, a star K, hashkacha, the way we know it today, is an American invention. L'chayr. There is, and we'll talk about this, what happened to Teirach and then Bisura, and what happened to Nemanis, etc., etc., but it's an American invention that grows out of a uniquely American problem with a solution. I'll tell you what I mean. In America, there's a big push for separation of church and state. Right? It's from our founding documents, we separate church and state. The government cannot enforce religion. Now, in most kehilas in Europe in the olden days, the kehila had the right, usually from the government, some sort of imprimatur from the government, from the local government, to enforce its standards, be it as it was. And therefore, shechita or kashrus or whatever would be a relatively easy thing for the Rav de Massa to enforce. Because he had a certain amount of powers that were given to him by the kingdom, and he'd be able to enforce these rules of shechita. Things were small, first of all, and things were enforceable. In New York, when you start developing, many shechtim and many things, and many shuls, and many shilas, so early in the early days, in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, She'eris Yisrael, this shul, sued a butcher in New York City for selling treifah meat. He had a sign in his store that said kosher, kosher l'mahadrin, and it wasn't kosher. And the kashrus agency, call it, or the rabbanim or the bezdin of She'eris Yisrael, sued the store saying, Hayatachan, you're advertising, you're saying kosher. It's not kosher. Now, the premise of their suit was that kosher is not something. He was Yid, yeah, sure. Unfortunately, most of the good and bad guys on all sides here are going to be Jews. The She'eris Yisrael sues them, and they say that kosher means kosher, and this is not kosher. To which the butcher goes to court and successfully defends, saying separation of church and state. The church, the state, so to speak, the state apparatus in New York City does not get to decide what kosher is. You guys can't decide what kosher is. Kosher is whatever I think it means. I said it means this. You said it means that. Okay, that's fine. She'eris Yisrael said, no, kosher is a word. It means something. Words have definitions, right? Words have meaning. It means kosher, and kosher can be defined however kosher is defined. To which the court said, no, we can't be involved in this, and they let it go. And the butcher won the case. The butcher won the case to be able to sell treifah meat. Now this is in the early 1800s, and this creates a unique American problem in shechita. A unique American problem in kashrus is that the rabbanim and the kilas have no way to enforce what they say. They have no way to say that what I say is the true thing and what you say is not the true thing. And the solution is going to end up being a uniquely American solution, which is trademark and patents. The way hashkachas today are able to enforce their ability is because it's a trademark. The OU symbol is a trademark. The star K is a trademark. These are all trademarks. And trademark law in the United States is very robust. And that has absolutely nothing to do with kashrus. That's not separation of church and state. In order to use my trademark, if my trademark would be vegan, or it would be about, environmentally friendly, or it's about kashrus, and that's why Ataka, you'll find on a lot of products, there'll be a panel of different trademarks there. Some of them are things we recognize, and some of them have absolutely nothing to do with us. They're just all sorts of gobbledygook, but they're trademarks. And ad kedei kach, that the first companies to take on hachsherim were the ones who bedafka mandated that the symbols should be symbols, and not like in Eretz Yisrael, hachsher usually is Hebrew words, right? Even today, chsidish hachsherim in America, whatever, but the original American hachsherim, like the OU, and the early ones, are all symbols. Because it's just a trademark symbol. It only means something to someone who knows what it means. It doesn't mean anything to someone who doesn't know what it is. Someone else, it means gluten-free. It doesn't mean anything. So the American problem ends up spawning an American solution of hashkachas. But we're skipping a little. So let's just go b'hadraga. Let's talk about some of the famous kashrus machleksim fights, shechita fights that happened in New York City. Now, one of them is a very strange fight, a strange mahalach that happened in New York City. It seems the minig in New York in the early 1800s was as follows. When you would bring a cow to shechta, you'd bring it to the butcher. The butcher would take a long needle and he would puncture the veins on the neck of the cow, which is right near where you need to be shechting it. He'd puncture the veins on the neck of the cow with a micro puncture that would drain out the blood. They would let the blood drain for a few hours until the animal was mamish weak on its feet and could barely stand. They'd let it stay for another few hours, a day, whatever, etc., and then they'd shecht it. And the benefit of this was that the meat that would be produced by an animal that was drained beforehand would be whiter. It would be a lighter colored meat, and white meat was considered fancy. White meat was considered the better meat, the elite meat. So it was like a little trick. Instead of serving veal, which is actually naturally lighter, which is more expensive, you could take a fully grown cow, drain the blood. Now, a day later, the meat looks like veal. Voila, you have veal on the market. So aside for the corporate, subterfuge that's going on over here, that you're selling it for at least 12 cents a pound instead of 9 cents a pound, back then in the 1800s, you're also selling meat that is possibly treif. Because you're puncturing the kana of the animal, or the veshet of the animal, with this needle, and you're not leaving it enough time to see if it recovers, it doesn't recover. Now, before you jump to any conclusions and say, look, it's pashut, it's basic, of course it's treif. So the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Nun Gimel Nun Hayim Beis and in Bechiris and Daf Zayin talks about bleeding an animal. There existed something in Bimei Chazal also as bleeding an animal, and it was done. The two sugis are kind of a little bit steer to each other, meaning one says one reason, one says another reason. Either it's because the animal was too cold, or because the animal was ill, like a different illness. But there was a method of bleeding the animal. But l'chayra, the bleeding that Chazal are talking about was not bleeding it directly from the neck, samuch to the makom avridin. The bleeding, it was done in other locations. And it's also yitachon that after you bleed an animal, provided you give it enough time to recover, it could be fine. Meaning, we're not saying that by bleeding an animal, automatically it makes it treif like this and it's dead. It's a dead animal and you're done. It's kind of a gray area. There is Gemaras that are mashma like this, that mashma Chazal knew about bleeding animals and maybe allowed bleeding animals. The question is exactly what the time frame would be, or how much, how little, etc. Now this started a huge fight in New York City between this sefer. I cannot find it. I looked for it. It's a sefer called Sefer Chein Tov by a Shechita, Reb Aaron Tzvi Friedman. He was the pusher of being makel on this shaila. Aaron Tzvi Friedman was a Shechita in New York City. By all accounts, it seems he was a Yerei Shemayim. Was not a bad guy, although his detractors would say he was a terrible guy, and we'll see in a minute. But Aaron Tzvi Friedman was a Shechita. He put out a sefer called Chein Tov, and he was the one who was pushing that this doesn't invalidate the animal. This doesn't make the animal a treif automatically. Now he writes, he says this is something that Goyim do it, Yidden do it. Hein Be'ir in New York, Hein B'cholam Makomis Hashesvivis New York, in New York, in the suburbs of New York. Ein echad me'em asher liyakiz dam me'agalam asher yinichem lamed yomi yamayim after shekana yisam. Says common practice is to drain the blood and let it sit for a day or two. V'sha'alti espiyam, he says, Madua Yasuke. He says, I came here, I'm a new sheikhet on scene over here, and I asked them, why do you do this? Amruli, they said, Pnei sha'agalam asher yevayu New York, v'sivesel, me'viyam oisem besvinas rachik min New York. They come on boats, a great distance from New York. V'ayim kol yimei nesiyah noisam alasvina. On the boat, the whole time, the whole duration of the travel, they stand. It seems like they're on like barges that would come like up the rivers or whatever. They were on barges, and they would stand, and the sun would bake on their backs. They come here in very poor condition. And he says, Adarabba, if you don't be make his dam, then they can't even live for another day. He says, and this is something that I validated, I checked. This is emes barar. I confirmed that this that they're telling me is true. He says, I shared this over in the Beis HaMedrash. Amruli, and they told me, Shagoin Rav Shlomo Adler, Harav mi London, Hashem Medinas Anglia, Nohag Heter Lahakis. He was makel to do this. V'ine Kain Hayab Medinas Poland. And likewise, they were makel like this in Poland. Asher Hayad Var Behemis, he says. Then he says, V'lotzis kol adeis. In order to make sure that I'm not just jumping to conclusions too quick, he says, Shalachnu shut, lishal pi ha'go'inim bali mefarshi ayam b'levov, v'zet shuvasan. I sent a letter to the Goinim in Lvov and Lemberg to ask them, and the Goinim in Lvov and Lemberg could mean a few people. It could either mean Rav Matcha Ettinger, it could either mean the Shalom Meshiv, it could mean others. In this context, it means the Shalom Meshiv. And the Shalom Meshiv writes him back a short letter, says the Shalom Meshiv as follows, Yisu Haram Shalom L'Kvei Rabbanim. There's another Shechit who's involved, Rav Yodel Middleman, who the Shalom Meshiv wrote. Incidentally, the Shalom Meshiv in Shalom Meshiv, other Chuvas, has Chuvas to Rav Yodel Middleman. Shalom Meshiv had like correspondence with Rav Yodel Middleman before he even moved to America and after he moved to America. So clearly, again, someone I know very little about, but I know that the Shalom Meshiv considered him to be, someone worth talking to. So he was definitely not an Amoritz. So the Shalom Meshiv writes that I received a letter from you and Rav Yodel Middleman, B'dvar ha'shaylu l'inyan ha'kazas dam. He says, Kvar hetiru prushim hadavar. He says, don't worry, the Prushim ready in the old country will make on this Indian. B'shulch some Sefer, like going v'tzadik where Moshe Sefer, Pressburg, like going Bal Bris Avram, v'yafa, kivanenu. And you guys, you were mechaven good, meaning the Shulchan Torah that you wrote me to be makel on this, you're good, you're on target. V'gam pay b'medina seinu, he says, even in our Medina, in Galicia, makizim dam l'chala behemes b'li pay tzepeh. Raki says, shehei al yedei uman. It should be with a professional, someone who knows what he's doing, not someone who's, I'm going to take a stick and stab it into the neck of the animal. That could be problematic. Do it with a professional. When he signs, sorry, Yosef Shal Natanzin, Av Bezdin, the Kili Kadesh, Lvov Vagal. Okay. So now they got a real heavy hitter from Lvov, the Shaila Meshiv, to sign on to the Shaila and say that you could be Saimach on this. Now, comes along another Shechit. His name is another Rav Shechit. His name is Rabbi Yosef Moshe Aronson. He wrote a sefer called Matei Moshe. Again, a sefer I don't have, can't find. But he wrote a sefer where he goes Eish Lahava against this. Chas v'shalom. The mamish bringing tarfas to everybody in New York City. It's the worst thing. And he writes a whole, long rebuttal. He says, Hine, I got here off the boat in New York, Matzasi, I found Shekal Ha'ir, Eichlem Basar Agalim, Hamadu Karim, that are stabbed. He says, B'chdeshi Abasar, Lavam V'tzach. Now, it's an interesting thing to note over here. When each tzad, when they bring the reason, the rationale for it, says something different. The Mekilim say the reason was for the health of the animal. The Oisrim say the reason was to make the meat white. And in all the chuvas, you get like a lot of cross-pollination of the reason. So it's really very hard to know what the actual reason why it was being done, why. They're each operating kind of under their own premise. Like, the Oisrim are operating under the premise that this is purely an economic shtick that serves no medicinal value to the animal. It could only have downsides, aser. And the Metirim are looking at it like, no, this is something the animal needs for medical value. You want to rather it sells better? Maybe it sells better. It doesn't sell better. Maybe it's interesting to see, they're not really talking to each other. Each one's kind of saying their own reasons. But he says, I find this, and he says, it's pashit that the animal is weakened to the point of death. By the time they drain the blood, it can barely stand. And the animal is mamish, mamish weakened, and he says, and it can't be that this works. He says, I found over here that Rav Aaron Tzvi Friedman and Rav Yudel Middleman are makel to do this, but I asked around, he says, in other places, there Baltimore, Yesham Rav Mumche V'chacham Muflig, Rav Avram Rees, another Rav, this one I've heard of actually, a Rav from Baltimore, he says, Talmud Chacham Gadol, V'gam Hu Aser Akaza. He also says it's Aser. L'chol Hashem B'koyle. He said, I also sent a letter to my friend, a Rav in Cincinnati, and he says it's Aser too. He says, Upai New York, Parza Mechshela Yidei Shnayim. These two no goodniks, spread this Mechshela all over New York City, but everywhere else, everybody knows that this is not okay, he says. And it's Pasha, the Shechita has to be Aser, he says. And then he says again, in order to make sure that I'm also not jumping to conclusions too fast, I'm also going to send letters back to Europe to collect answers. And he sends a letter to Rav Shamshin Rav Hirsch, Rav Elazar Levi Horowitz, Rav Shlomo Kluger, Rav Yitzchak Levi Bamberg. He's many Gedolei Rabbanim, and of course, because it wouldn't be fun without this, he sends a letter to Rav Motche Zev Ittinger, the Shalom Yeshiv's brother-in-law and co-Rav of Lemberg, who we know already, did not see eye to eye on several shaylas. So of course it would never be fun without that, and he sends that. Now, he gets letters back, strong letters l'isser. He gets a letter here from Rav Shlomo Kluger, Lamashal, the God Ladar. Rav Shlomo Kluger says, he says, hey, now this is interesting, because Rav Shlomo Kluger had earlier been asked this shayla in his own chuvas, in shayla's chuvas, Tov Tam V'das, and Rav Shlomo Kluger was makel, to be makers on the blood, to drain the blood from the animals before shachting them. So it says Rav Shlomo Kluger, hey, Nemes.
What year are we talking?
This is, what you want an exact year? We're talking, hang on. I'll tell you after. We're talking 1850-ish, but 1848 maybe, that range. Shlomo Kluger writes, he says, Hein emes, the bechiburi toiv tam v'das, madura kama, hetarti behemes anasabem hakaza. Says, it is true that in the past, in my chuvas, I was making on this shaila. Aval ein le'dimyan klal lezeh. It's not similar to the shaila you're asking me. The oisin ha'galim, Dinidunim Shalanu, Hem Asafik Nevelis Mamish, Hem Machilim Nevelis Yisrael. Says what you're talking about over here, what you're describing to me, is Mamish, he says, a Safik Nevela. V'chol Misha B'Shem Yisrael Yechoneh, anybody who considers themselves a religious Jew, V'amdu Avoisav Al Har Sinai, Chalila Lelechel Mizah. And his parents stood on Har Sinai, Chas V'Shalom Tif from these, V'yim Uvdalim Imenu Kemuvdum Nevelis Mamish. He should separate himself from these cattle, like Nevela Mamish. V'chol Oichlov, Yashamu Ra, yeah, fine. V'chol ha'mayrim b'zel leheter, heim ha'mayrim ki ben seira mayr v'asid and litin asadin, he says. And anybody who's being mayr leheter on this, and that means including the Shalom Eshiv, and including Agaret, these other smaller Rabbanim, are being mayr like mayr ben seira mayr. So Rosh Shlomo Kluger feels very strongly, and again, it's based on the presentation of the facts that he's receiving from the Shechita in New York City, where he comes to believe that it's very, very different than the case that he was Mekel on previously, and then the case that the Chassam Sofer was Mekel on previously, and he says that this is Mamash Aser. And he collects a few of these letters from other Gedolei HaPoskim, back and forth, to which the camp that supports it, Rav Aaron C. Friedman, sends back to the Shalom Eshiv again. He says, I'm getting pushed to the wall here. I mean, you told me that it's mutter, but now I'm getting tons of feedback from all these other Rabbanim that it's Aser. Is it? Do you stand by what you said? To which the Shalom Eshiv writes back. He says, I got your letter, and I saw this very harsh quote that you said, and I saw people, Mechanatz b'Shem Rav, Utzaik, Kruchya, people are screaming, and I answered, fine. He says, he ends up wrapping up, it's a short tshuva, and he says, I stand with what I'm saying, and it's still mutter to eat these cattle. Now, what the Shalom Eshiv throws in at the end was to me like a min nevuah. He has like a nichta b'tzida in the end of the paragraph of this tshuva. Shalom Eshiv throws something in that's kamin nevuah, and it's going to shape kashrus in New York City for the next, call it almost 100 years after this. Shalom Eshiv writes as follows: Ma'oid yipala be'inai, he says, I'm stunned. Achariki atem be'eretz merchak. All of you who are writing, who are fighting about this, you live in a very, very distant land. V'terascham k'tzara. There's a very, very small amount of Torah over there. It's minimal. You have a few guys who could learn a little bit. There's not much going on. You have a very, very small amount of Torah. The overwhelming majority of people who show up there are Amaratzim. That's who comes there, he says. The small group of people who do know something over there. Why are you fighting with each other through me, through the Poskim in Europe? What are you fighting with each other the whole day about? He says, you have to get on the same page. The Yeresi, he says, Ma'oid, Ulai Ba'avor Machlekes, I'm terrified, he says, I'm afraid, maybe perhaps because of this Machlekes, because of this inability of the few Talmidei Chachamim who exist in this world to get on the same page, Chalila, Tizgarshu Min Aretz V'letuchel Aretz L'Seis Eschem. This land is not going to be able to hold you. It's not going to do well for you. Ki im kala Tigarshun. You're going to be kicked out, he says. Hashem Yirachem Aleichem, V'yitim Bilvavchem, Ki Tiyah La'aguda Achas. Hashem should be merachem on you and give the sense, the good sense in your heart that you should be be'aguda achas. V'terachmu aleichem v'al b'neichem, and he should have rachmanas on you and your children. V'tasu shalom v'tiyah lebracha b'karav ha'aretz. He should make peace and should be shalom b'karav ha'aretz. Ki yoyes nafshechem v'nefeshem hatir ba'adchem hanal yosef shalom. To me, this was Kimin Nevuah. The Shalom Eshiv was telling them, you guys, the few Talmidei Chachamim that exist over here, you're making a terrible mistake. Instead of figuring out, coming together and making avada kashrus and figuring out what the right thing that could work for your situation is, you're at each other's necks. You're trying to make chumras and get rabbanim from here and from there to sign on, to join in, and all that's going to happen is you're going to have nothing. And Layalenu, that's exactly what happened. New York City, from the time when this ended, from about, call it 1840s, until all the way into the mid-1900s, through Rabbi Yaakov Yosef's Tkufa that we'll get to in Hashem, devolved into mamish the Wild West. There was sheikhtim of every variety, from every camp, doing whatever they wanted, with zero accountability to anybody. And what the Shalom Eshiv said was absolutely true. There was a total breakdown of any rabbinic oversight. There was nothing going on, and everybody, Ish Hayasher ben Avyasa mamish, to the point where I want to read you a short quote. The Ridvaz, who came to be a Rav in Chicago in 1902, and left with his tail between his legs as quick as anybody can, he writes as follows. He says, "B'medina hazois nikbetzu ubo b'nei adam mikol arba katzves tevel." This is a country. He'll give us a picture from 50 years down the line what it looks like. This is a country that they came from arba katzves tevel. Ve'einish makir chaveirei. Nobody knows anybody. It's just like it's a melting pot. Miuzah ish b'beisai u'beirei. Nobody knows what you were. I was an engineer back in Russia. Nobody knows what you were before you came here. Many people who were considered oisvarfs, where they came from, he gives speeches now like the priest in his church. They put on a Hamburg and they became a Rav. The Korish Rambi saw Rabbanim, he says. Most people, not most, a lot of people who are Pashim, Mezuyev, in Gansen Puzzle, where they came from, come here, they put on a Hamburg, they become a Rav. He says, K'may Kain, Bo Risham Gmurim Bebeisam, She'eshtatu V'nasu Kan butchers. He says, there are plenty of Risham from over there who come here, and over here they call themselves butchers. Meichri Basar Kasher, Lupamayid Yisrael. He says, V'harabbanim halalu, V'schabrim ha'katzavim halalu. You have these Rabbanim with these butchers, Hakatzav ha-butcher, Oim B'tachas Hashkachas harav, and this is all in quotation marks, he says. So in 1902, the Ridvaz is writing caustically and with great bitterness, and Itaka leaves shortly after, that the situation has come to the point where you have Rabbanim with Shechtim and Mamish Isha Yasha Ben of Yasa. Now, it's to me just a marvelous thing that the Shalom Eshev was literally saying that in the end of his tshuva. Now, Mitzvah we'll get to the next week, we'll continue to Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, who was the first and only chief rabbi of New York City in his attempt to try to solve this, and the actual halacha shaylas and stuff that came out of that, and then Mitzvah will go on to Hechsherim and etc. Thank you.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.